She was in my kitchen, in my chair, eating breakfast off my plates. She had been in my house for 9 days. When I walked through my own front door that morning, she stood up, looked me in the eye, and said, "Who are you? Get out of here right now." I had owned that house for 22 years, restored every room by hand. I had the deed in my car. I said, "I live here." She said, "I'm calling the police." I said, "Please do." She was the HOA president. She had cut a master key to my front door and 11 others. No board resolution, no homeowner consent, no legal authority of any kind. I sat down in my own chair and waited. The officers arrived in 14 minutes. She told them I was the intruder. She had my neighbor's voicemail, my mail on the counter, my notepad on the table with her grocery list on it. The senior officer looked at her driver's license, then at my deed, then at her. He said, "Ma'am, your address is not this address." It was over before she said another word. Before we begin today's story, drop your location in the comments, destroy that like button, and subscribe for more stories just like this. Walter Greer had spent 40 years in federal property law before he retired, and in that time, he had read more property descriptions, deed conveyances, easement instruments, and title abstracts than any reasonable person would choose to count. He had argued property rights cases before federal administrative tribunals, had drafted model statutory language for 3 states' property protection frameworks, and had once testified before a Senate subcommittee on the relationship between federal land management policy and private property owner rights. He understood property in the precise legal sense, the bundle of rights that ownership conveyed, the specific instruments required to transfer or encumber those rights, and the exact consequences that followed when someone acted as though those instruments were optional. He also understood property in the way that has nothing to do with law. He understood it in the way you understand something you have worked on with your hands for 11 years, room by room and season by season, until the thing you started with and the thing you finished with are separated by so much deliberate effort that the finished version is inseparable from the person who made it. The mansion on Ashford Hill had been built in 1887 by a regional railroad financier named Carver Ellison, who had wanted a house that announced, from the road, that its owner had arrived at a permanent station in life. Ellison had hired an architect from Philadelphia and told him to build something that would still be standing when everyone who knew Ellison's name was dead. The architect had taken the instruction literally. 11 rooms across 3 floors, Victorian detailing on every exterior face, a wraparound porch with turned balusters at both the first and second floor levels, a central hall staircase with hand-carved newel posts, and foundation walls of cut limestone that the contractor had sourced from a quarry 40 miles east and hauled to the site by wagon over 6 weeks in the spring of 1886. The house had been standing for 137 years. Carver Ellison had been dead for 112 of them. The architect's name was on the original drawings, which Walter had found in the County Historical Society's archive in 2003 and had framed and hung in the central hall. Walter had bought the property in 2002. He was 50 years old, recently widowed, and had been living in a 2-bedroom condominium in the state capital for the 3 years following his wife Margaret's death from ovarian cancer. He had not been looking for a mansion. He had been driving the county roads one October Saturday in the way that grieving people sometimes drive, without destination, the motion itself being the point, and had seen the Ashford Hill property from the county road below, a Victorian roofline above the tree line, the wraparound porch visible through the autumn-thinned canopy, and a for sale sign at the gravel drive's entrance that looked as though it had been there long enough to qualify as a permanent fixture. He had pulled over and sat in the car for 20 minutes looking at the roofline. The property had been in probate for 4 years following the death of its previous owner, an elderly woman named Ruth Fenwick, who had lived in the house alone for the last 18 years of her life, and had maintained it to the standard of someone who could no longer manage the deferred maintenance that a structure of this age and complexity required. The roof had 3 sections that needed replacement. The wraparound porch's south face had rot at the base of 7 balusters. The limestone foundation was sound. Ellison's architect had built it to outlast everyone, but the interior plaster had cracked in 30 or 40 locations across all 3 floors, and the kitchen and both full bathrooms had not been updated since the 1960s. The electrical system was original knob and tube in the 3rd floor rooms in the attic. The heating system was a converted oil furnace of 1954 vintage. Walter had bought it in November 2002 for $340,000, which the probate attorney had described as a fair price for the property in its current condition, and which Walter had understood was fair in the sense that a property requiring significant restoration work was worth less than the same property restored. He had moved in January 2003 and had begun the restoration in February with a roofer he found through the County Historical Preservation Office, a contractor named Boyd, who specialized in period residential roofing, and who had looked at the 3 failing sections and said he could match the original slate profile with a modern synthetic slate that would last 60 years. Walter had said, "Do it right or don't do it." Boyd had done it right. The restoration had taken 11 years. Walter had not rushed it, partly because he was working full-time through most of the period and could only give weekends and vacation weeks to the house, and partly because he had decided in the first year that rushing was the wrong approach for a structure that had been built slowly and carefully in 1887, and that deserved the same treatment in its restoration. He had worked room by room, the central hall first, then the parlor, then the library, then the dining room, then the kitchen, then the bathrooms, then the second-floor bedrooms, then the third-floor rooms that had been servants' quarters in Ellison's time, and that Walter had converted to a study, a drafting room, and a guest suite. He had hired specialists for the work that required them, a plaster restoration contractor for the cracked interior walls, an electrician who understood historic residential rewiring, a millwork shop that could reproduce period molding profiles when sections needed replacement. He had done the painting himself, every room, because he wanted to. The wraparound porch had taken 3 summers. The rot had been more extensive than the initial inspection had suggested. Once he had pulled the damaged balusters, he had found rot in the sill plate at the south face that required full sill replacement over a 40-foot section. He had done the sill work himself on 3 consecutive vacation weeks in the summer of 2008, working from 5 in the morning until the heat became unreasonable around 2 in the afternoon, and then sitting on the porch's north face in the shade with a glass of water and looking at what he had done. His son Daniel had come up for one of those weeks. Daniel was 24 that summer, working his first job in Portland, and had worked alongside him without complaint, asking questions about the construction techniques and listening carefully to Walter's explanations. Walter had thought, on the last day of that week, that it was the best week he had experienced since Margaret died. He had finished the restoration in 2013. He had marked the completion by sitting in the central hall on a Saturday afternoon in October with the original architect's drawings spread on the floor, and going through every room in sequence against the drawings, noting what had been restored to the original specification and what had been adapted for modern use. The list of adaptations was short: the kitchen appliances and fixtures, the bathroom fixtures, the electrical panel, the heating and cooling system. Everything structural, everything architectural, everything visible from the public face of the house was restored to the 1887 specification, or as close to it as modern materials and techniques permitted. He had folded the drawings carefully, returned them to their frames in the central hall, and poured himself a glass of bourbon from the library cabinet. He had lived in the house for 22 years. It was the place where he understood himself most clearly, not because it was large, or because it was impressive from the road, though it was both, but because every room in it represented a specific period of work and decision and accumulated understanding. He knew the house the way you know something you have repaired. Not just the surface, but the structure behind the surface, the condition of the thing beneath the condition you could see. The cardiac event had been minor in the clinical sense, an arrhythmia episode that his cardiologist had described as a warning rather than an event, requiring a procedure to correct the electrical pathway and 6 to 8 weeks of supervised recovery. Walter had listened to the medical description and had organized his response to it the same way he organized his response to most things, practically and without drama. He had called Daniel in Portland. Daniel had said, "Come here for the recovery." Walter had agreed. He had prepared the house for a 3-month absence with the systematic attention of a person who had spent 40 years dealing with the consequences of inadequate documentation and insufficient preparation. He had stopped the mail, arranged automatic bill payment for the utilities, confirmed the alarm system's cellular backup was active, and walked every room, noting the condition of everything that might require attention before he returned. He had locked every entry point and tested every lock. He had set the interior temperature hold for 58 degrees, enough to protect the plaster and the millwork, without running the heating system at full operation for 3 months. He had backed the car to the road's edge in the garage and left the garage locked. He had one standing instruction for the departure. Ed Callum, who lived in the Victorian Revival House 2 properties north on the same gravel road, was the nearest neighbor Walter knew well enough to ask for a standing favor. Ed was 63, a retired high school principal, attentive and reliable in the way that people who have spent careers managing institutional environments are attentive and reliable. Walter had given him the emergency contact number, Daniel's cell, and had said, "If anything looks wrong, call me. Not Daniel first, me." Ed had called on day 5. Walter had been in post-procedure recovery, the second full day of the restricted activity period following the corrective procedure, which his cardiologist had scheduled for day 3 of his Portland stay. He had been sleeping more than usual, the anesthesia residue and the body's repair work combining into a fatigue that his cardiologist had said was normal, and that Walter had found in practice more complete than any fatigue he had experienced since Margaret's final months. He had not heard his phone. Ed had left the voicemail at 7:43 in the evening. "Walter, it's Ed. I don't want to alarm you, but there are lights on in the house. The second floor lights, east face. And there's a car in your driveway I don't recognize. Dark blue sedan, newer model. Could be nothing. Call me when you get this." Walter had not retrieved the voicemail until day 8, 3 days after Ed had left it, 3 days during which he had been in the restricted activity period and had been, on Daniel's firm instruction and his cardiologist's firm instruction, away from his phone for significant portions of each day. When he retrieved it, he listened to it twice, looked at the timestamp, and did the arithmetic. Day 5 of his absence, lights on in the house, unrecognized vehicle. He called Ed at 8 a.m. on day 8. Ed confirmed the lights had been on for at least 3 evenings that he had observed. The vehicle had been present each time. He had not approached the property because Walter had said call, not investigate. Walter thanked him and ended the call. He sat in Daniel's guest room for 10 minutes. He thought about the alarm system, which he had set before leaving and which should have triggered on any unauthorized entry, and which had not sent him any alert notification, which meant either the alarm had not been triggered or it had been bypassed. He thought about who had access to the property and who had a reason to be there. He thought about the HOA president, a woman named Karen Mossfield, whose violation notices he had received periodically over the years, and who he had, in the organized way he handled administrative correspondence, responded to with precise 1-paragraph replies, citing the relevant governing document provisions and noting the absence of any violation. He had never met her in person. He packed his bag. He told Daniel he needed to go home for a day and would explain when he knew more. Daniel started to object. The cardiologist had said 6 to 8 weeks, and Walter said he understood and that he would drive carefully and that he was not having symptoms and that this was a property matter that required his presence. Daniel said, "Dad." Walter said, "I'll call when I get there." He drove the 4 hours from Portland without stopping, arriving on Ashford Hill the following morning, Tuesday, day 9 of his absence, the 9th morning that someone else had been in his house. He came up the gravel drive at 7:15. The dark blue sedan was parked in his driveway. He sat in his car for a moment and looked at the house. The second-floor east-face windows were lit from inside. His house, his lights, his windows, and a car in his driveway that was not his car. He got out, walked to the front door, and put his key in the lock. The key worked. It was his house and his lock, and it worked the way it had worked for 22 years. He opened the front door and walked in. What the evidence would later show about Karen Mossfield's 9 days in Walter Greer's house was assembled from 6 sources: the neighborhood social media page's post history with timestamps, the mail forwarding confirmation from the Postal Service showing the request date and the address it had been submitted from, the HOA's master key distribution log that Karen herself had maintained, the statements of 2 board members who had received specific comments from Karen about Walter's expected return, Ed Callum's voicemail timestamp, and his written statement about the vehicle's presence, and the physical inventory Walter had conducted, room by room, on the morning he returned. A document he had produced with the methodical completeness of a man who had spent 40 years understanding that evidence was only as useful as the precision with which it had been gathered. The picture those 6 sources assembled was not the picture of a spontaneous decision. It was the picture of a series of decisions, each one following the previous with the internal logic of a person who had been telling herself a story about a property and its absent owner, and had, at some point between the first decision and the last, stopped distinguishing between the story and the facts. Karen Mossfield had been HOA president of the Ashford Hill Homeowners Association for 6 years. She had run for the presidency in the year that the previous president, a retired contractor named Holt, had declined to seek a third term, and had essentially handed the position to whoever wanted it badly enough to organize a slate. Karen had wanted it. She had campaigned, if the word applied to a 12-household residential association, with the specific energy of someone who had been waiting for an institutional role commensurate with her own assessment of her capabilities. She had won the presidency with 8 of the 12 eligible votes, had reorganized the board's committee structure in her first month, and had introduced the Master Key program in the spring of her second year. The Master Key program had been presented to the board as an emergency access initiative, a practical response to the reality that Ashford Hill's residents included several elderly homeowners who lived alone and who might, in a medical emergency, be unable to let emergency personnel into their homes. Karen had cited 2 anecdotal cases from other communities where delayed entry had worsened medical outcomes. She had said the program required a board vote to authorize, and had called for that vote at the same meeting where she introduced it. The vote had been 3-2. The 2 dissenting members had asked about homeowner consent and liability, and had been told by Karen that the emergency access justification was legally sufficient. No attorney had been consulted. No homeowner had been formally notified. The Master Key distribution log, a document Karen maintained in the HOA's management files, showed 12 keys cut and distributed to Karen herself as the sole holder, a distribution structure that she had described in the log as centralized emergency access management. No board resolution existed in the HOA's recorded governing documents. The vote had been recorded in the meeting minutes as authorized, but the authorization had never been formalized in the instrument, a recorded resolution, that the HOA's own bylaws required for any new policy affecting homeowner property access. This was a procedural gap that Karen had either not known about or had not considered important. The effect of the gap was that the Master Key program existed as an entry in a meeting's minutes and as 12 physical keys in Karen's possession, but it did not exist as a valid policy instrument under the governing documents that defined what the HOA's board was authorized to do. She had used the keys twice before Walter's absence, in the 2 years preceding it. The first use had been a wellness check on a resident named Dorothea Haynes, 81 years old, who had not been seen for 3 days following a winter storm. Karen had entered Dorothea's home using the Master Key and had found Dorothea in good health, simply housebound by the snow, and not answering her door because she had assumed any knock was a solicitor. Dorothea had been startled by the entry, but had not objected formally. She had told her daughter about it, and the daughter had called Karen and expressed concern, and Karen had said it was a welfare program for the community's elderly residents. And the daughter had said she wished she had been notified, and Karen had said she would note the preference. She had not changed the program. The second use had been a wellness check on a resident named Gerald Foss, 77, following a neighbor's observation that his car had not moved for 4 days. Karen had entered Gerald's home and found him recovering from a back injury, mobile but uncomfortable, not in distress. Gerald had been less equanimous than Dorothea. He had told Karen directly that he did not consent to entry into his home and that he would like to know by what authority she had entered. Karen had cited the emergency access program. Gerald had said he had not consented to any such program and had asked for documentation of the board authorization. Karen had provided the meeting minutes. Gerald had read them, noted the absence of a recorded resolution, and said he intended to raise the matter at the next board meeting. He had raised it. Karen had tabled the discussion. Gerald Foss lived 4 properties south of Walter's mansion. He had been watching Karen's management of the Master Key question with the specific attention of someone who had been told his objection had been tabled, and who had not forgotten that it had been tabled. Walter's departure had been known to Karen through the mechanism by which most things in a 12-household residential association became known. a combination of visible activity and the social fabric of a small community. She had seen the luggage being loaded into Daniel's vehicle on the morning of the departure. She had seen the house go dark. She had known, from previous HOA correspondence and from the neighborhood's general awareness, that Walter was dealing with a cardiac health matter that had been described in community terms by Daniel in a brief conversation with Ed Callum that Ed had mentioned at the next neighborhood gathering, as requiring a recovery period of several weeks in Portland. She had told the board's vice president, a man named Phil Garrett, within the week of Walter's departure, that Walter was probably not coming back given his age and health situation. She said it in the context of a conversation about the HOA's annual property condition survey. The survey required a notation for any property whose owner was absent for an extended period, and Phil had noted it without comment because it had been offered as a practical observation rather than a significant claim. She had made the same comment to the board's treasurer, a woman named Lois Drummond, in a separate conversation about the HOA's property roster. Lois had also noted it without comment. Neither Phil nor Lois had asked what Karen meant by probably not coming back. Neither had asked whether Walter had communicated any such intention. It was the kind of offhand remark that passed through a small community's informal communication without friction because it arrived in a practical context, and was delivered by the person who managed the community's administrative functions, and who was therefore assumed to know things that other residents didn't. Karen had entered Walter's mansion on day 3 of his absence, at 11 in the morning on a Thursday. She had used the master key at the front door. She had told herself, and this was the story the evidence assembled afterward, the internal justification that her subsequent actions made visible, that she was conducting a wellness check on a property whose elderly owner had departed for a medical procedure, and who had not arranged for anyone to monitor the property's condition during a potentially extended absence. She had told herself that a property of this age and complexity required monitoring. She had told herself that she was the appropriate person to provide it. She had walked through all 11 rooms on that first entry. She had spent 40 minutes in the house. She had looked at the central hall's restored plaster and the architect's drawings framed on the wall and the hand-carved newel post at the staircase's base, and the library's built-in shelving, and the view from the 3rd-floor study across the hillside and the valley below it. She had stood in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor's east face and looked at the room's proportions and the morning light through the east-facing windows and the restored millwork around the window frames. She had locked the front door on her way out and driven home. She had come back the next day, and the day after that. On day 5, the evening Ed Callum had observed the lights and called Walter, she had brought a bag. She told herself it was more practical to stay overnight than to drive back and forth for the monitoring visits. She had used the master bedroom. She had told herself it was the most appropriate room for a caretaker's use, given its size and its 2nd-floor security. By day 7, the bag had become several bags. Her clothing occupied the left side of the master bedroom closet. Walter's clothing hung on the right, undisturbed, which was a detail the physical inventory would later note with the precision it deserved. Her toiletries were arranged on the left half of the master bathroom's vanity. She had not used Walter's toiletries or moved them. She had been, in her own account of events, respectful of the property. She had been treating it, in the story she was telling herself, as a property under her care rather than as a property she was occupying. The mail forwarding request had been submitted on day 6. Karen had gone to the post office and submitted a change of address form, routing her personal mail to Walter's address on Ashford Hill. The Postal Service's processing timestamp would later show the submission date with precision, day 6 of Walter's absence, 2 days after she had first stayed overnight. She had not submitted a temporary forwarding request, which would have carried an end date. She had submitted a standard forwarding request, which remained active until canceled. The Postal Service had processed it in 48 hours. On day 8, 2 pieces of Karen's personal mail arrived at Walter's address, a credit card statement and a dental appointment reminder, and Karen had placed them on the kitchen counter. The social media posts had gone up on day 7. Karen had taken 2 photographs, one from the front drive showing the mansion's restored Victorian facade in the morning light, and one from the 2nd-floor east-face window showing the valley view that Walter had been looking at from that window for 22 years. She had posted both to the Ashford Hill neighborhood social media page with the caption, "Ashford Hill's finest property, finally being looked after properly." She had not named the address. She had not named the owner. She had not explained the basis of her presence. 3 residents had recognized the property within the first hour. Ed Callum had recognized it immediately. He had been Walter's neighbor for 14 years and knew the facade from the county road in every season. He had not commented on the post. He had gone back and checked his phone and confirmed that Walter had not called him back and had driven to the end of his own driveway and looked south down the road at Walter's gravel drive entrance and confirmed that the dark blue sedan was still there. Gerald Foss had recognized the property from the valley view in the second photograph. He had left a comment on the post. "Is this Walter Greer's property?" Karen had not replied. A 4th resident had replied to Gerald's comment. "Looks like it. Is Walter back?" Karen had not replied to that either. By the evening of day 7, the post had 47 likes and 4 comments, 2 of which were questions about the property's owner, and 2 of which were compliments on the photography. Karen had liked the compliments. She had not replied to the questions about Walter. She had gone to bed in Walter's master bedroom on the night of day 8, the same night Walter retrieved Ed's voicemail in Portland, the same night Walter called Ed and heard the confirmation and packed his bag, and had set her alarm for 7:30. She had been planning to drive to the grocery store in the morning. She had a list on the kitchen counter, written on a notepad she had found in Walter's library desk. The notepad had Walter's name printed at the top, a personalized notepad, the kind that had been a professional gift at some point, with his name and his former firm's address. She had used the 3rd sheet of the pad. The first 2 sheets had Walter's own handwriting on them, notes from some previous task, the precise content of which the inventory would document, and she had turned past them to the blank 3rd sheet without, apparently, considering what it meant to be writing a grocery list for someone else's house on a notepad with that person's name printed at the top. That was the story the evidence assembled. Not a plan, precisely, but a series of self-permissions, each one following the previous because the previous had not produced a consequence that required her to stop. She had entered because she had a key and a justification. She had returned because returning had felt natural after the first entry. She had stayed because staying had felt practical after the returns. She had forwarded her mail because staying had become, in her internal accounting, a semi-permanent arrangement. She had posted the photographs because she had, by day 7, arrived at a place in the story she was telling herself where the property felt, in some way she had not fully articulated even to herself, like something she was right to be in. She had 47 likes on the post. She had Walter's grocery list on the kitchen counter. She had her alarm set for 7:30. Walter's key was in the front door lock at 7:15. The front door opened at 7:15. Walter stepped into the central hall and stood for a moment, the way he always stood when he first entered the house after any absence, taking the room in, confirming its condition, the habit of a man who had restored every inch of the space, and who registered changes in it the way other people registered changes in a face they knew well. The plaster was intact. The architect's drawings were on the wall in their frames. The newel post at the staircase's base was as he had left it. The hall smelled different, a combination of unfamiliar personal products and recently cooked food that did not belong to the house's normal, closed absence atmosphere of aged wood and plaster dust. He set his bag at the base of the stairs and walked toward the kitchen. Karen Mossfield was at his kitchen table in a bathrobe. His chair, the one at the table's east end that faced the window in the hillside view, the chair he had sat in for breakfast every morning for 22 years. She had a plate in front of her, his plate, the everyday ceramic set he kept in the cabinet left of the sink, with eggs and toast on it. She had a mug of coffee to the right of the plate. She was reading something on her phone and had not heard him come in over the sound of the exhaust fan running above the stove, where a pan was still on the burner with the heat on low. Walter looked at the pan on the burner, at the plate, at the mug, at the bathrobe, at the woman in his chair at his table in his kitchen. He looked at the kitchen counter and saw the mail. 2 envelopes with Karen Mossfield's name on them at a forwarding address that was his address. He saw the notepad from his library desk with a grocery list written on the 3rd sheet in handwriting that was not his. He said, "Good morning." Karen looked up from her phone. She saw a man in the kitchen doorway, older, travel-worn, a bag presumably set somewhere behind him, car keys in his left hand. She did not recognize him. She had seen Walter Greer's name on HOA correspondence for 6 years, and had driven past his property on the Ashford Hill Road for 6 years, and had been living in his house for 9 days, but she had never spoken to him directly, and had never been close enough to him at any neighborhood event to fix his face in her memory with the specificity that recognition required. She saw a stranger in the kitchen doorway, and her response was the response of someone who had, over 9 days, arrived at a place in her own story where her presence in the house felt authorized. She stood up from the table and said, "Who are you? What are you doing in here?" Walter said, "I live here." She said, "This is private property. You need to leave right now." He said, "I'm aware it's private property. It's mine." She said, "I don't know who told you that, but you need to leave before I call the police." Walter looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years in legal proceedings, and who recognized, in the structure of what was happening, something he had seen before in different forms. The specific confidence of a person who has been operating without opposition for long enough to have confused the absence of opposition with the presence of authority. He walked past her to the stove, turned off the burner under the pan, and sat down at the kitchen table's west end, the chair across the table from his own chair, which Karen was now standing beside. He said, "My name is Walter Greer. I have owned this property since November 2002. I have the deed in my vehicle if you'd like to see it. I drove from Portland this morning. My key opened the front door, and my alarm code disarmed the system, which you may have noticed when you entered, because both of those things work, because this is my house." Karen said, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I am the HOA president, and I have legal access to this property, and I am calling the police." Walter said, "Please do." She picked up her phone from the table and called 911. Walter sat at the west end of his kitchen table and waited. He looked at his house while he waited. The kitchen's restored cabinetry, the tile he had chosen and installed himself over 2 weekends in the fall of 2009, the window above the sink with the hillside view he had been looking at every morning for 22 years. He looked at Karen's grocery list on his library notepad on the counter. He looked at her mail with her name on it at his address. He looked at her coffee mug on his table next to his plate with her breakfast on it. He was not angry. He was something more precise than angry. He was in the condition he had been in at the beginning of every significant legal matter he had ever handled, which was the condition of complete clarity about what the facts were and what they meant and what was going to happen next as a result of what they were. Karen was speaking to the 911 dispatcher. She said there was an intruder in her residence on Ashford Hill, that he had entered without permission and was refusing to leave, and that she needed officers immediately. She gave the address, Walter's address. She said she was the legal occupant and the man had entered unlawfully. Walter listened to her describe him as an intruder in her residence. He noted the word residence. He noted legal occupant. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. The kitchen ceiling's restored plaster that he had hired the specialist contractor to repair in the summer of 2007. The work that had taken 3 weeks and that he had watched with the attention of someone who wanted to understand the technique well enough to assess whether it was being done correctly. He looked back at Karen and waited. The officers arrived in 14 minutes, 2 of them, a man and a woman, the male officer senior based on his insignia. They came to the front door, which Walter had left open, and entered the central hall and found Walter standing at the kitchen doorway and Karen behind him, now dressed, having gone upstairs while Walter waited, and returned in her own clothes with her personal items collected into one of her bags, which she had set at the base of the stairs, near Walter's bag. The senior officer looked at the 2 bags side by side at the staircase base, and then looked at Walter, and then looked at Karen. He said, "What's the situation?" Karen said, "This man entered my residence without permission. I am the HOA president, and I have legal occupancy of this property for a property management and welfare function, and this man entered without authorization and refuses to leave." The senior officer looked at Walter. Walter said, "My name is Walter Greer. This is my property. I have owned it since November 2002. I drove from Portland this morning and entered with my own key using my own alarm code. I can provide the deed from my vehicle. I can provide my driver's license. I have a voicemail from my neighbor, Ed Callum, who lives 2 properties north, time-stamped 9 days ago, noting an unfamiliar vehicle in my driveway. The vehicle in my driveway is not mine. I have been in Portland for the past 9 days, recovering from a cardiac procedure. I retrieved the voicemail 2 days ago and drove home this morning." He said it in the sequence he would have presented it to a tribunal, facts in chronological order, each one specific and verifiable, nothing extraneous. The senior officer said, "Do you have identification?" Walter said yes, and walked to the front door and retrieved his document folder from the exterior pocket of his bag. The folder he kept in every bag he traveled with, containing his driver's license, his vehicle registration, his insurance cards, and, because he was a retired property attorney who had spent 40 years understanding that documentation mattered, a photocopy of his deed to the Ashford Hill property. He handed the officer his driver's license and the deed copy. The officer looked at the driver's license. He looked at the deed. He looked at the address on both. He handed them to the second officer and looked at Karen and said, "Can I see your identification?" Karen produced her driver's license. Her address on the license was her own home address, 4 properties north of Walter's on the same road, not this address. The senior officer looked at her license address and then at the address on Walter's deed and said, "Ma'am, your address is not this address." Karen said, "I am here in an official HOA capacity. The Master Key Program authorizes my presence as part of the association's Emergency Property Access Initiative." The officer said, "Do you have documentation of that authorization?" Karen said, "The board voted to approve the program." The officer said, "Do you have a copy of the board resolution or the homeowner's written consent to the access?" Karen said, "The minutes reflect the vote." The officer said, "Do you have the minutes with you?" She did not have the minutes with her. She had the master key. She had placed it on the kitchen counter when the officers arrived, a physical demonstration of her claimed authority that had instead become the most important single object in the room, sitting on Walter's kitchen counter next to his notepad with her grocery list on it. Walter looked at the master key on his counter. He said to the senior officer, "I did not consent to any master key program, in writing or otherwise. I have never received written notice of any such program from the HOA. I have the HOA's correspondence file for the past 6 years. It contains no notification of a master key program and no request for my consent to property access." The junior officer had stepped to the front door and was on her radio. Walter understood she was running the address. He walked to the kitchen table and sat down. Not at the west end this time, at the east end, his chair, the one facing the window in the hillside. He looked at the view he had been looking at for 22 years. Karen stood in the kitchen doorway. Her bag was at the staircase base. Her mail was on the counter. Her grocery list was on the counter. The master key was on the counter. The junior officer came back inside and handed Walter's license and deed copy back to the senior officer and said something to him at a low register that Walter did not attempt to hear because he did not need to hear it. He knew what the address search returned, and he knew what it meant, and he was content to sit at his kitchen table and let the process complete itself at the pace it needed to complete. The senior officer looked at the license and deed copy again, and then looked at Karen and said, "Ma'am, the registered owner of this property is Walter Greer. The address on his license and his deed are the same address. The address on your license is a different address." Karen said, "I told you, I am here in an HOA capacity." The officer said, "You told the dispatcher this was your residence. Is this your residence?" A pause. Karen said, "I have been managing this property." The officer said, "Were you asked to manage this property by the owner?" Another pause. Longer. Karen said, "The owner is in Portland." The officer said, "The owner is sitting at the kitchen table." Walter did not turn around. He looked at the hillside through the window. The morning light was coming across the valley the way it always came across the valley at this hour in this season, low and direct, the hillside's tree line casting long shadows across the lower slope. He had watched this light from this chair thousands of times. He watched it now. Behind him, the senior officer asked Karen to step outside. The junior officer stayed in the kitchen doorway. Walter heard Karen's footsteps cross the central hall and the front door open. The junior officer looked at Walter. She said, "Sir, is there anything in the house that belongs to you that you'd like to document before we proceed?" Walter said, "Everything in the house belongs to me, but yes, I'd like to document it." He stood up from the table and picked up his phone and began in the kitchen, a room-by-room inventory, photographed and noted, starting with the counter, the master key, the grocery list on his notepad, the 2 pieces of mail with Karen Mossfield's name at his address. He photographed each item in place before touching it. He had been doing this kind of documentation work for 4 decades. He was unhurried and complete. The junior officer watched him work and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The man was documenting his own house, item by item, with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what the documentation was for and exactly where it was going to end up. Outside, the senior officer was on the phone with the watch commander. The hillside light moved across the valley the way it always did. The junior officer had run the address from the front door, while the senior officer held the room. The return came back clean and unambiguous in the way that 22 years of uncontested ownership returned. Walter Greer, the full legal name, the parcel number matching the deed copy Walter had handed over. No liens recorded, no encumbrances, no disputes in the county's property record, no pending legal action of any kind against the title. The ownership chain from the 2002 purchase was intact and unclouded. The property was Walter's in the complete sense, not subject to any claim, not encumbered by any instrument, not shared with any party. His name was the only name on the record. The senior officer had the deed copy in one hand and the address return on his radio in the other, and both said the same thing. He looked at Karen. He said, "The county's property record shows Walter Greer as the sole registered owner of this parcel. 22 years of continuous ownership, no recorded easements, no liens, no encumbrances of any kind. Can you explain your basis for being in this property?" Karen had been standing near the front door since the senior officer had asked her to step out of the kitchen. She had her bag, one of the bags she had carried down from the master bedroom before the officers arrived, set on the porch's top step behind her. She had the look of someone whose internal story was undergoing rapid revision, the specific expression of a person who has been operating with complete confidence in a framework that is now being examined by people with the authority to determine whether the framework is real. She said, "I am the HOA president of the Ashford Hill Homeowners Association. The association has an emergency access program that authorizes board officers to enter properties for welfare and property management purposes. I entered this property under that authorization." The senior officer said, "Do you have documentation of that authorization?" She said, "The board voted to approve the program 2 years ago. The minutes reflect the vote." He said, "Do you have the minutes with you?" She did not. She had her bag, her phone, and the master key she had placed on the kitchen counter, a physical object that she had apparently believed would serve as credential, and that was now sitting on a counter in a house belonging to a man who was photographing it in place before touching it. The officer said, "Do you have a written board resolution formally establishing the program?" She said, "The minutes are the authorization." He said, "The HOA's governing documents, are they recorded with the county?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Do those documents authorize unilateral officer entry into private residences without homeowner consent?" The pause before her answer was long enough to be its own answer. She said, "The emergency access provision covers welfare checks on residents who may be unable to." He said, "Was this a welfare check?" She said, "It was a property management and welfare function." He said, "Did the homeowner request the property management function?" She said, "The homeowner is in Portland." He said, "The homeowner is at the kitchen table. Did he request this function before he left?" Another pause. She said, "The program doesn't require individual homeowner requests. It's an association-wide initiative." The senior officer looked at the junior officer, who had completed the address run and returned to the front door, and was now standing at the threshold between the porch and the central hall. The junior officer's expression was the professional neutral of someone who was hearing a version of events that the physical evidence was not supporting, and who was allowing the questioner to continue developing the record without editorial commentary. The senior officer said, "Ma'am, I need to ask you directly, how long have you been in this property?" Karen said, "I've been conducting monitoring visits." He said, "How long have you been staying in this property?" "Overnight." She said, "I've been here for several days to ensure the property was properly maintained during the owner's absence." He said, "Several days. Can you be more specific?" She said, "Approximately a week." He said, "A week. And did you have the owner's permission to stay here for a week?" She said, "The HOA program." He said, "I'm asking about the owner's permission specifically. Did Walter Greer give you permission? in writing, verbally, in any form, to stay in his house while he was in Portland. The pause this time was the longest yet. The morning light was coming through the central hall's east window. The architect's drawings were on the wall. The hand-carved newel post was at the staircase's base. Karen's bag was on the porch step. Her other bags were still upstairs in the master bedroom, where Walter was now photographing their arrangement in the closet. His clothing on the right half, her clothing on the left half, each item documented in place. She said, "I acted under my HOA authority." The senior officer looked at her for a moment without expression. Then he said, "Wait here, please," and stepped off the porch and walked to the cruiser and got in and picked up the radio for the watch commander. The junior officer stood at the threshold and looked at Karen and said nothing. Karen stood on the porch with her bag at her feet and her hands at her sides, and the story she had been telling herself disassembling in the specific way that stories disassemble when they encounter a framework, legal, institutional, evidentiary, that doesn't recognize any of their terms. The HOA program, the wellness check, the property management function, the board vote. None of these phrases were producing the effect she had expected them to produce, which was the effect they had produced in every prior context where she had deployed them, the effect of authority confirmed, of institutional legitimacy recognized, of the questioner accepting the framework and proceeding within it. The officers were not proceeding within it. Inside the house, Walter moved from the master bedroom to the master bathroom, Karen's toiletries on the left half of the vanity, his own on the right half, undisturbed. He photographed both halves. He noted in his phone's voice memo, "Master bathroom vanity, left half, personal care items belonging to unknown individual, brand names and product types documented. Right half, owner's items, undisturbed." He was not narrating for drama. He was narrating because 40 years of property law had taught him that a complete contemporaneous record was worth more than any subsequent reconstruction, and that the value of documentation was directly proportional to the precision with which it had been gathered at the moment when the facts were physically present and unaltered. He had the same approach to documentation that he had brought to every significant matter in his career: unhurried, sequential, specific, and complete. He had learned it from a senior partner in his second year of practice who had said, once, that the side that documented better almost always won, not because documentation was persuasive in itself, but because complete documentation closed the gaps through which alternative narratives escaped. He had never forgotten it. He was applying it now in his own house, room by room, in his bathrobe. He had changed out of his travel clothes in the second-floor guest room because he was home, and changing into comfortable clothes at home was what he did, and he saw no reason to defer the habit because there were officers in his central hall. He came back downstairs with his phone and his voice memo recorder and his document folder, and found the junior officer still at the threshold, and Karen still on the porch, and the senior officer still in the cruiser. He said to the junior officer, "I have a voicemail I'd like you to note for your report. May I play it?" She said, "Yes, sir." He played Ed Callum's voicemail on speaker. Ed's voice, unhurried and specific, the timestamp at 7:43 p.m. 9 days ago. "Walter, it's Ed. I don't want to alarm you, but there are lights on in the house. The second-floor lights, east face, and there's a car in your driveway I don't recognize. Dark blue sedan, newer model. Could be nothing. Call me when you get this." The junior officer noted the timestamp in her report pad. She looked at the dark blue sedan in the driveway, visible from the front door through the porch framing. She wrote, "Vehicle and driveway, dark blue sedan, consistent with neighbor voicemail description." Walter showed her his phone's drive history, the navigation app's route record from Portland to Ashford Hill, begun at 6:40 a.m. that morning, completed at the property address at 10:07 a.m., 4 hours and 7 minutes of driving time. He showed her the app's timestamp of the route's origin point in Portland, Daniel's address, where he had been staying for 9 days. She noted it. He said, "I also have this." He showed her the mail on the kitchen counter, the 2 pieces of mail with Karen Mossfield's name on them, forwarded to his address. He said, "This is not my mail. My name is Walter Greer. These envelopes have another person's name on them forwarded to my address. I did not authorize any mail forwarding to this address for any person other than myself." The junior officer looked at the envelopes. She noted the names and the forwarding address in her report pad. Walter said, "And this." He showed her the grocery list on his library notepad. His name printed at the top, the list in Karen's handwriting on the third sheet. He said, "This notepad is mine. The handwriting is not mine." She noted it. The senior officer came back from the cruiser. He had been on with the watch commander for 11 minutes. He came up the porch steps and stopped beside Karen and looked at her and said, "Ma'am, the watch commander has reviewed the situation. The property's registered owner is present on the premises with documentation confirming ownership. You have been in the property for approximately 9 days without the owner's knowledge or consent. Your claim of HOA authorization does not constitute a legal right of entry or occupancy under any provision I've been made aware of. At this point, I need to ask you to gather your belongings and leave the property." Karen said, "I want to speak to my attorney." The senior officer said, "You're free to do that. I'd encourage it. But first I need you to gather your belongings from inside the property and leave." She said, "I acted in good faith under my HOA authority." He said, "Ma'am, the homeowner is present, the property is his, and you need to leave. That's where we are right now." Walter was standing in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Karen on the porch, the HOA president, the person who had sent him violation notices for 6 years, in the formal institutional language of a small residential association, exercising what it believed was administrative authority. She was standing on his porch with her bag at her feet, and the watch commander's assessment delivered through the senior officer's voice, and the story that had carried her through 9 days in his house was not carrying her any further. He said to the senior officer, "She has personal items in the master bedroom and the master bathroom on the second floor. I've documented their location and condition. I'd like an officer present while she collects them." The senior officer said, "Yes, sir." The junior officer went upstairs with Karen. Walter stood in the kitchen and listened to the footsteps on the stairs. His stairs. The staircase he had restored to the 1887 specification. The newel post he had refinished by hand over a weekend in 2006. He listened to the footsteps cross the second floor to the master bedroom. He looked at his kitchen, his table, his chair at the east end, the window with the hillside view. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Karen had made and sat down in his chair and drank it while he waited. The coffee was fine. She had bought decent coffee. He would note that in no document and to no one, but it was true, and he registered it with the same precision he registered everything else. Outside, the senior officer was on his radio again, completing the watch commander debrief and beginning the formal incident report that would carry this morning's facts. The address return, the deed, the voicemail timestamp, the mail forwarding, the grocery list on the personalized notepad, the 9 days, into the official record where they would sit permanently, available to Diane Rourke when she needed them, which would be soon. Walter called Diane Rourke at 8:43 a.m. from the kitchen table, the coffee in front of him, the sound of Karen and the junior officer moving through the master bedroom overhead, tracked in the ceiling as a pattern of footsteps he followed without effort. The master bedroom's east-to-west axis, the closet, the bathroom, back to the bedroom, the particular sound of a person collecting belongings under observation, which was a sound with a different rhythm than the sound of a person collecting belongings alone. Diane picked up on the second ring. She was 61, a former federal land use counsel who had moved to private property law practice 18 years ago, and whose professional background overlapped with Walter's at enough points that they had maintained a working relationship after his retirement. She occasionally consulted him on complex title questions, and he occasionally called her when a property matter required active legal representation rather than his own analysis. This was the second kind of call. He gave her the situation in 4 minutes. He said, "I returned to my property this morning to find the HOA president in occupancy. She has been here approximately 9 days. She entered using a key she claims is part of a master key program the HOA board authorized. She has clothing in the master bedroom, toiletries in the master bathroom, forwarded mail on the kitchen counter, and a grocery list written on my personal notepad. 2 officers are present. She is currently collecting her belongings under officer supervision. I need you to pull the HOA's governing documents and tell me what the master key program's recorded authorization looks like." Diane said, "Give me the association's name and the county." He gave her both. She said, "I'll call you back within the hour. Don't let her leave until you have everything documented." He said, "She's leaving under officer escort. The documentation is complete." She said, "Good, I'll call you." He ended the call and looked at the kitchen counter. The master key was still on the counter. Karen had not taken it when she went upstairs, either because she had forgotten it in the movement of the moment, or because she had understood, at some level, that taking it in front of the officers would be a visible act, with implications she preferred not to make visible. Walter photographed it again from a closer distance, the key's profile and the HOA's small tag attached to its bow, showing the association's name and the key's designation, Master, printed on the tag in capital letters. The word chosen by Karen when she had the tags made, and that now sat on his kitchen counter with the complete unambiguity of a physical object that meant exactly what it said. He walked to the base of the stairs and called up, "Officer, when you come down, I'd like to walk you through the rest of the house before she leaves." The junior officer said, "Yes, sir, 2 minutes." He went back to the kitchen and waited. He heard the footsteps complete their circuit of the master bedroom and move to the hallway and start down the stairs. Karen came first, 2 bags in her hands, a third bag strap over her shoulder. The junior officer came behind her, empty-handed, her report pad open. They came into the central hall and stopped. Walter said to Karen, "I'd like you to remain in the central hall while I show the officer the rest of the property. It will take 15 minutes. Karen said nothing. She set her bags at the foot of the stairs, next to Walter's bag, and stood in the central hall with the expression of a person who had run out of institutional language and was standing in the gap where it used to be. Walter walked the junior officer through the house in the sequence he had photographed it earlier, using the photographs as the baseline and showing her the physical conditions they documented. He started in the master bedroom, the closet, where Karen's clothing had occupied the left half, and which was now empty on that side, Walter's clothing hanging on the right half, undisturbed in the condition it had been in when he left 9 days ago. He showed the officer the photographs on his phone, the before, with Karen's clothing present, the after, now that she had removed it. He asked the officer to note the comparison in her report. The master bathroom. Karen's toiletries had occupied the left half of the vanity. They were gone now. She had collected them. Walter showed the officer the before photographs. The officer noted them. Walter opened the cabinet under the left sink and showed her a single item Karen had missed in the collection, a small, travel-size bottle of something that had rolled to the cabinet's back wall. He pointed to it and said, "That belongs to her, not me. I'd like that noted as a found item not present in the property before my departure." The officer photographed it and noted it. He walked her through the second-floor guest bedroom, undisturbed the way he had left it, and the third-floor study and the drafting room, both undisturbed. He walked her back downstairs to the library, where he showed her the notepad on his desk. The first 2 sheets with his own notes, the third sheet gone. Karen had taken it when she collected her belongings, the grocery list removed from the pad. He showed the officer that the third sheet was missing, tore carefully from the perforation point, and noted it. He said, "She wrote a grocery list on that sheet and has taken it. I photographed it in place before she removed it." He showed the photograph. The officer looked at the photograph. The grocery list in Karen's handwriting on the notepad with Walter's name printed at the top, and noted it in her report. He walked her to the kitchen last. He showed her the counter, the master key, the 2 pieces of forwarded mail. He picked up the mail, not opening it, holding it by the edges, and showed the officer the postmarks. The first envelope was postmarked 6 days ago, the delivery date consistent with the Postal Service's standard 2-day forwarding processing for a forwarding request submitted on day 6 of Walter's absence. The second envelope was postmarked 4 days ago. Walter said, "This second piece of mail was postmarked 4 days ago. The forwarding request would have been active for it to arrive here. She submitted the forwarding request expecting to still be here 4 days ago, and still be here when this arrived. She was planning to stay beyond 9 days. The officer looked at the postmark. She noted it. He walked her to the refrigerator and opened it. Karen had bought groceries, a modest supply, the kind of inventory a person established for a stay of indeterminate length, rather than the kind associated with a brief monitoring visit. Eggs, butter, a block of cheese, a carton of orange juice, salad ingredients in the crisper, a container of yogurt, condiments. None of it was Walter's. He had cleared the refrigerator before leaving, as he always did for an absence of more than a week, and the refrigerator had been empty when he locked the house 9 days ago. He photographed the interior. He said, "I emptied this refrigerator before I left, Everything in it now is hers. I'd like that in your report." The officer noted it. He closed the refrigerator and looked at the counter one more time. The master key, the mail. He said, "I'd like to keep the master key as evidence." The officer said, "We'll take custody of it for the report. You'll get a receipt." He said, "That's fine." He looked at the key on the counter for a moment, the physical instrument of everything that had happened in his house for 9 days. A cut piece of metal with a tag that said, "Master." Karen had ordered it made, had the tag printed, had distributed it to herself as the sole holder of a program she had instituted without a recorded board resolution, without homeowner consent, and without the legal authority that the HOA's own governing documents would have required her to obtain if she had bothered to read them carefully enough to understand what they required. Diane called at 9:51. Walter was in the kitchen. Karen was in the central hall. The senior officer was on the porch, completing the incident report. The junior officer was at the kitchen doorway. Diane said, "I've pulled the Ashford Hill HOA's complete recorded governing documents from the county's public filing system. Declaration, bylaws, all recorded amendments, all recorded board resolutions. I've reviewed everything." He said, "And?" She said, "There is no recorded board resolution establishing a master key program, or any emergency access program of any kind. There is no amendment to the bylaws authorizing officer entry into homeowner properties. There is no provision in the declaration permitting the board or any board officer to enter a homeowner's property without the homeowner's written consent, except in the case of a declared emergency affecting the community's common areas, and that provision specifically excludes private dwelling interiors." He said, "The meeting minutes reflect a board vote." She said, "Meeting minutes are not a recorded resolution. The HOA's bylaws require a formal recorded resolution for any new policy affecting homeowner property rights. A vote noted in minutes that was never formalized into a recorded resolution is an incomplete action. It authorized the board to create the policy, but the policy was never created in the form the governing documents required. The Master Key Program, as Karen implemented it, is not a valid HOA policy. It is an informal initiative she implemented on her own authority." Walter said, "So when she distributed keys to herself," Diane said, "she was a private individual, cutting keys to other people's homes without authorization. That is the accurate description of what she did." He said, "How many properties?" Diane said, "The governing documents cover all 12 properties in the association. If she followed the program as she described it, master keys for each unit, she has keys to 11 other people's homes besides yours." Walter said, "I want that in the filing." She said, "It's going in. I'm filing the criminal trespass complaint this afternoon. 9 days of unlawful occupancy, the mail forwarding, the social media posts. I'm filing the civil action for unlawful entry, conversion of property use, and the Master Key Program's unauthorized operation. I'm also filing a formal complaint with the county's HOA regulatory office regarding the key distribution to the other 11 properties." He said, "The other residents need to know." She said, "They will. The regulatory complaint is public. I'll make sure Ed Callum knows today so he can inform the neighborhood informally before the formal notice goes out." He said, "One more thing. She told 2 board members I was probably not coming back." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That goes in the civil filing. It speaks to intent. She wasn't conducting a wellness check on a resident expected to return. She was occupying a property she expected to become vacant." He said, "That's what the mail forwarding says too." She said, "I know. I'll talk to you this afternoon." He ended the call and put his phone on the kitchen table and looked through the doorway at Karen in the central hall. She was standing with her bags at her feet and the senior officer's pen moving across his report pad on the porch, and the junior officer's neutral professional expression at the kitchen doorway. And she had been in this house for 9 days, telling herself a story whose terms, the program, the wellness check, the board vote, the HOA authority, had not survived contact with the governing documents, the property record, the watch commander, and Diane Rourke's 1-hour review of the county's public filing system. Walter looked at her for a moment. He said, "Ms. Mossfield." She looked at him. He said, "My attorney has reviewed the HOA's recorded governing documents. There is no recorded resolution establishing a master key program. The program you've been operating is not a valid HOA policy. The keys you have cut for the other 11 properties in this association are unauthorized. My attorney is filing a complaint with the county's HOA regulatory office this afternoon. The other residents will be notified." Karen said nothing. She looked at him with the expression he had seen many times in 40 years of legal proceedings, the expression of a person who had just understood, fully and without remaining ambiguity, that the story they had been telling was not going to hold. He said, "I'd like my key back." She looked at the kitchen counter. The master key was there. The junior officer had not yet taken custody. Karen looked at it, and then looked at Walter, and then looked at the junior officer, and said nothing. The junior officer stepped to the counter and picked up the master key and placed it in an evidence envelope and wrote on the envelope and initialed it and said to Walter, "You'll get a receipt." He said, "Thank you." He picked up his coffee cup from the kitchen table. It was cold. He poured it out and started a fresh pot because it was his kitchen and his coffee maker, and he was home, and he was going to have a decent cup of coffee when the officers left, and Karen was gone, and the house was his again, in the complete and unambiguous sense that it had always been his, and would continue to be his after today, in the way that Diane's filings and the county's regulatory record and the officer's incident report would now confirm permanently. He stood at the counter and waited for the coffee, and listened to the senior officer come up the porch steps and say to Karen, "Ma'am, you're free to go. I'll need a phone number where you can be reached." She gave it. He wrote it down. She picked up her bags and walked out the front door and across the porch and down the steps and across the gravel to the dark blue sedan. Walter watched her go from the kitchen window, the window above the sink with the hillside view. He watched her put the bags in the back seat and get in and start the car and back out of his driveway and turn north on the road toward her own address, 4 properties away. The coffee finished. He poured a cup and sat down in his chair at the east end of the kitchen table and looked at the hillside through the window. It looked exactly the way it always looked. Walter found the posts at 10:20, sitting at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee and his phone, working through the documentation sequence he had established before the officers left. He had been on the Ashford Hill neighborhood social media page perhaps 4 times in the 2 years since Ed Callum had suggested he join it, a platform that served the 12 Household Association as a combination of community bulletin board, lost pet notification system, and occasional forum for the kind of minor dispute that small residential communities generated and resolved without consequence. He had never posted anything. He checked it now because Diane had asked him, before ending the morning call, to look for any public statements Karen might have made about the property during his absence. He found them immediately. They were the page's second most engaged posts in the past 2 weeks, 47 likes between them, 4 comments, the photographs clear and well composed, in the way that a person with a good phone and a genuine appreciation for the subject matter produced without effort. The first photograph was his house from the front drive. The Victorian facade and morning light, the wraparound porch, the restored balusters, the limestone foundation visible at the base, the roofline against the hill behind it. It was a good photograph. The light was the particular low morning light that hit the east face correctly at this season and at this elevation. And Karen had either known that or had been lucky with her timing, and the result was a photograph that showed the house the way Walter saw it when he came up the drive on a clear morning, the thing Carver Ellison's architect had built in 1887 to announce permanent arrival, still announcing it 137 years later. The second photograph was the valley view from the second-floor east-face window, his view, the one he had been looking at from his chair at the kitchen table every morning, and from the master bedroom window every evening for 22 years. The valley in the morning light, the hillside's lower slope, the tree line at the far side, the sky above it. Also a good photograph, also taken from inside his house without his knowledge or consent. The caption on both, Ashford Hill's finest property, finally being looked after properly. He read the caption twice. He looked at the word, finally. He looked at the phrase being looked after properly, the implication embedded in it that the property had not previously been looked after properly, that some deficiency in its prior management had been corrected by Karen's presence. He thought about 11 years of restoration work, room by room, season by season, the plaster contractor and the millwork shop, and the 3 summers on the porch, and Boyd's 60-year synthetic slate roof, and the weekend he had refinished the newel post by hand. He thought about the architect's drawings framed in the central hall, which Karen had walked past every day for 9 days. He screenshotted both posts, both with the timestamp and the like count, and the comments visible in the frame. He screenshotted the comments individually. Gerald Foss's comment asking if this was Walter Greer's property. The second resident's reply asking if Walter was back. The third resident's comment noting the valley view looked like the Greer place. No reply from Karen to any of them. He screenshotted the absence of Karen's reply as a scroll of the comment thread showing the questions unanswered. He sent all of it to Diane at 10:31 with a message. Social media posts, 2 photographs of the property taken from inside and outside during my absence. Caption implies prior management deficiency. 3 residents asked publicly if I was aware. No reply from her. Timestamps consistent with day 7 of her occupancy. Diane replied in 6 minutes. Perfect. Goes in the civil filing under public misrepresentation of occupancy status. The caption language is useful. It implies a claim of legitimate presence to a public audience. I'll call you at 2. Walter put his phone down and looked at the posts one more time before closing the app. 47 likes. 12 households in the association, meaning some of the likes had come from outside the association's membership. The page was accessible to anyone in the county's neighborhood network. 47 people had liked photographs of his house, taken without his knowledge, by a person who had been sleeping in his master bedroom for 9 days. He noted the number and closed the app. He called Ed Callum at 10:45. Ed picked up immediately and said, "Walter, I was hoping you'd call. I drove past this morning and saw the cruiser in your driveway." Walter said, "I'm home. There was a situation. I need to tell you what happened, and I need to ask you for something." He gave Ed the summary in 8 minutes, the same summary he had given Diane, compressed to the facts Ed needed to understand the situation, and the facts Ed needed to provide in his written statement. Ed listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of him, and when Walter finished, there was a brief silence, and then Ed said, "Good Lord, Walter." Walter said, "The voicemail you left is the earliest time-stamped evidence that she was in the property. Day 5 of my absence. The officers have noted it. Diane will need a written statement from you confirming what you observed, the lights, the vehicle, the dates of observation, your attempt to reach me, and the voicemail you left." Ed said, "I can do that this afternoon. I'll write it out and bring it over." Walter said, "Diane can take it directly if you prefer. I'll give you her number." Ed said, "I'll bring it to you first, and you can send it to her. I want to see the house is all right." Walter said, "The house is fine. Come at 3. Ed came at 3 with 2 pages of handwritten statement, the precise, clear handwriting of a man who had spent 30 years writing on boards and in grade books, and who understood that legibility was a courtesy to the reader. He had documented what he had observed from his own property. The lights on the mansion's second-floor east face visible from his driveway on the evenings of days 5, 6, 7, and 8 of Walter's absence. The dark blue sedan in the driveway on each of those evenings, and on the morning of day 6 when he had driven past on his way to the county road. His attempt to reach Walter by phone on the evening of day 5. The voicemail he had left at 7:43 p.m. His attempt to reach Walter again on day 7, which had gone to voicemail again without a message left, because he had not wanted to repeat himself. His awareness, from the neighborhood social media page, of Karen's 2 posts on day 7. He had recognized the property immediately, and had not commented because he had been uncertain whether to say anything publicly before speaking to Walter. That last detail Walter had not known. He read it and noted it, and said, "You recognized the posts and didn't comment publicly." Ed said, "I didn't think it was my place to start something on the page without knowing what you knew." Walter said, "That was correct, thank you." He photographed Ed's 2 pages and sent them to Diane at 3:18. Diane called at 2, as she had said she would, and called again at 4:15 to confirm the filings were complete. She had filed the criminal trespass complaint with the county prosecutor's office at 1:47 p.m. 9 days of unlawful occupancy, documented by Walter's physical inventory, the officer's incident report, Ed Callum's voicemail timestamp, the mail forwarding confirmation, the grocery purchases, and the social media posts establishing Karen's public claim of presence during the occupancy period. She had filed the civil action at 2:33 p.m., unlawful entry, conversion of property use, public misrepresentation of occupancy status, and the Master Key Program's unauthorized operation across all 12 properties in the association. She had filed the formal complaint with the county's HOA regulatory office at 3:50 p.m. regarding the unauthorized Master Key distribution. All 12 properties identified, all 12 homeowners named as potentially affected parties, Karen Mossfield named as the individual who had ordered the keys cut and distributed them to herself as sole holder, without recorded board authorization and without homeowner consent. Walter listened to the filing summary and said, "What are the other 11 residents' options regarding the keys?" Diane said, "The regulatory complaint triggers a county review. The county will notify all 12 homeowners of the program's existence and its unauthorized status. Each homeowner can then demand their keys' return or destruction, and can file their own civil complaint if they choose. The regulatory office can order the association to dissolve the program formally and require a recorded board resolution or bylaws amendment to establish any future access program, which would require a homeowner consent process." Walter said, "Gerald Foss has been trying to get the program reviewed for 2 years. Diane said, "Gerald Foss will receive the county's notification this week. What he does with it after that is his business, but he'll have the regulatory finding behind him." Walter said, "Good." He posted to the Ashford Hill neighborhood page at 6:47 p.m. He had written it at the kitchen table in 20 minutes, drafted once and not revised, because he knew what he wanted to say, and he said it the way he had written everything in 40 years of legal practice, plainly, specifically, and without a word that wasn't doing necessary work. The post said, "I returned to my home on Ashford Hill this morning after an absence of 9 days. I found the property occupied. The matter was resolved with the assistance of 2 county sheriff's officers and has been referred to my attorney. I want my neighbors to know 2 things. First, the Ashford Hill HOA's Master Key Program was never established by a recorded board resolution and does not constitute a valid HOA policy. Second, the county's HOA regulatory office has been notified and will be contacting all 12 homeowners in the association regarding the program's status and their options. If you have questions about your own property's key situation, my attorney Diane Rourke can be reached at the number below. The matter is now in the appropriate hands." He included Diane's number. He posted it and set his phone face down on the kitchen table and did not look at it again for 2 hours. When he picked it up, the post had 61 responses. Ed Callum had commented first. 3 words, "Glad you're home." Gerald Foss had commented second. 2 sentences. "I raised the Master Key issue at a board meeting 2 years ago and was told it was tabled. I am grateful this is now in the county's hands." The remaining 59 responses were a combination of expressions of concern from residents who had not known about the occupancy, questions about the key program from residents who had not known the program existed, and 3 comments from people outside the association's membership who had seen the post through the county network and wanted to express support. Karen had not commented. Her account showed as active. She had liked 3 posts from other pages in the past 4 hours. But on this thread, she was absent in the complete way that people who have no remaining institutional language to deploy are absent. Walter read Ed's 3 words, "Glad you're home," and thought about the voicemail Ed had left 9 days ago. The careful, unhurried voice, noting the lights and the unfamiliar vehicle, and saying, "Could be nothing, call me when you get this." And the 4 hours of driving this morning up the county roads, toward a front door that opened with his own key, because it was his house and his key, and it had always been his house and his key, and would continue to be. He put the phone down and went to the library, and stood for a moment looking at the notepad on his desk, the first 2 sheets with his own notes, the 3rd sheet gone where Karen had torn it out. He opened the notepad's cover. His name was printed there, the way it had been printed there since the notepad was made, the way it would continue to be printed there. He put the notepad back on the desk and went to bed. The emergency board meeting was called for Wednesday evening, 3 days after Walter's post, 2 days after the county's HOA regulatory office had sent its formal notification to all 12 Ashford Hill homeowners, advising them of the Master Key Program's unauthorized status and their options regarding key return and civil remedy. Phil Garrett had called the meeting, not Karen. Karen had not communicated with the board since Tuesday morning, when she had driven north on the road from Walter's property with her bags in the back seat and her phone going unanswered. Phil had called it because the regulatory notification had arrived at his address Wednesday morning, and he had read it and called Lois Drummond, and they had agreed that the board needed to act before the county acted for them. Karen resigned by email at 4:15 p.m., 45 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. The email was addressed to the full board, Phil, Lois, and the 2 remaining members, and was 3 sentences. She was resigning the presidency effective immediately. She wished the community well in its future governance, and she believed her service to the association had been conducted in good faith throughout her tenure. She did not mention Walter. She did not mention the Master Key program. She did not mention the 9 days. Phil called Walter at 4:30 and read him the resignation. Walter said, "The meeting should still happen. The program needs to be formally dissolved by recorded resolution regardless of who holds the presidency." Phil said he agreed and said the board would proceed with the agenda as written. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Phil had prepared a 3-item agenda: acceptance of Karen's resignation, formal dissolution of the Master Key program, and adoption of a new recorded resolution governing any future HOA access to homeowner properties. All 4 remaining board members were present. The vote on each item was unanimous, including Phil and Lois, who had received Karen's "probably not coming back" comment in separate conversations, and who had, in the 3 days since Walter's post, arrived at a full understanding of what that comment had meant and what it said about the 9 days that had followed it. Neither of them had been asked to do anything that Tuesday morning. Neither of them had known Karen was in Walter's house, but both of them had heard the comment and had noted it and had not asked the question the comment required. And that omission, minor as it had seemed at the time, sat differently now that the comment's context was fully visible. They voted yes on all 3 items without discussion that required recording. The Master Key program's formal dissolution was documented in a recorded board resolution filed with the county the following Friday. Phil had engaged the HOA's general counsel to draft it, a straightforward instrument that declared the 2019 Master Key Initiative void ab initio for failure to comply with the governing document's recorded resolution requirement, ordered all keys cut under the program returned to the board's custody within 14 days for destruction, and required that destruction be documented and certified. 11 keys were returned within the 14-day period. The 12th, Walter's, which the county sheriff's office had taken into evidence custody, was returned to Walter directly after the criminal proceedings concluded, at which point Walter took it to a locksmith and had it destroyed in front of the locksmith and kept the locksmith's written certification of destruction in his document folder. The new access resolution was filed concurrently. It prohibited any HOA officer, employee, or contractor from entering any homeowner's private dwelling without written consent from the dwelling's owner obtained specifically for the entry occasion, with the consent document retained in the HOA's records. The only exception was a county-declared emergency affecting the development's physical infrastructure, and even that exception required the county emergency manager's written authorization before any entry, not the HOA board's unilateral determination. Gerald Foss had submitted written comments to Phil during the drafting period, 2 pages, specific and detailed, citing the governing document's existing provisions and the county's HOA regulatory standards. Phil had incorporated both pages into the drafting instructions he gave the general counsel. The resulting resolution was, as Gerald noted when he read the filed version, exactly what it should have been in 2019 when Karen had first proposed the program. Gerald did not file his own civil complaint. He called Diane Rourke, reviewed his options, and decided that the regulatory finding, the program's formal dissolution, and the new recorded resolution achieved what he had been trying to achieve at the board meeting 2 years ago, and that adding a civil action to an already resolved situation was a use of his time and energy he preferred not to make. He did write a letter to the county's HOA regulatory office, thanking them for their handling of the complaint and noting that his 2022 board meeting objection to the program had been tabled without resolution. The regulatory office added the letter to the complaint file. The criminal trespass charge moved through the county prosecutor's office over the following 6 weeks. The prosecutor reviewed the complaint, the officer's incident report, Walter's physical inventory documentation, the mail forwarding confirmation, the social media posts, and Ed Callum's written statement, and offered Karen a deferred prosecution agreement, 18 months of compliance with program conditions, 120 hours of community service, full restitution to Walter as determined by the civil settlement, no contact with Walter or his property, and no HOA board participation of any kind during the deferral period. Successful completion would result in the charge's dismissal without a conviction record. Non-compliance would result in the charge proceeding. Karen accepted the agreement through her attorney, without a counter-proposal. The civil settlement was negotiated by Diane over 3 weeks. The other side, represented by a property defense attorney, Karen had retained the day after she left Walter's property. The settlement covered 4 items. The first was a professional property assessment. Walter had engaged an assessor to document the property's condition against his pre-departure documentation, confirming that no structural or aesthetic damage had been caused during the 9-day occupancy. The assessment found no damage beyond normal use wear on the kitchen surfaces and the master bathroom fixtures, which Karen had used for 9 days, and which Walter had cleaned and the assessor had cleared. The assessment cost was paid by Karen. The second was replacement cost for the groceries Karen had consumed from Walter's supplies. Walter had left a small quantity of dry goods and pantry staples that Karen had used during her stay, documented in the inventory. The replacement cost was negligible, but was included because completeness was the standard Walter had applied to every element of the documentation, and he saw no reason to make an exception at the resolution stage. The third was a contribution to Walter's legal fees. Diane had billed 31 hours across the complaint filing, the regulatory coordination, and the civil negotiation. Karen's settlement contribution covered 60% of that figure. The fourth item was the recorded acknowledgement. Diane had drafted it and had declined to negotiate its language. It was filed with the county under both Karen Mossfield's name and the Ashford Hill property's parcel number, and stated in 2 sentences that Karen Mossfield had entered and occupied the property at Walter Greer's Ashford Hill address between the dates specified, without legal authorization, without the owner's consent, and without any valid HOA policy instrument authorizing the entry or occupancy, and that Karen Mossfield acknowledged she had held no legal right to enter, occupy, represent ownership of, or exercise any control over the property at any time during or prior to the specified period. It was recorded permanently. Any title search on Walter's property would find it. Any background search on Karen Mossfield's name in the county's property records would find it. Karen's attorney had objected to the recording requirement. Diane had said it was non-negotiable. The objection was withdrawn. Walter signed the settlement documents on a Thursday afternoon at Diane's office. He read every page, which took 40 minutes, and which Diane's paralegal had seen clients decline to do in 30 seconds, and which Walter had no intention of abbreviating, because he had spent 40 years understanding that the documents you signed were the documents that defined your situation afterward, and that reading them completely before signing them was not optional. He had 2 minor language clarifications, both of which Diane made on the spot. He signed. He drove home and changed his alarm code, a new 8-digit sequence he generated from a method he had used for access codes since his federal practice years, a method that produced codes that were not dates or addresses or any other category of information that a person with knowledge of your life could guess. He tested the new code 3 times. He noted it in the document folder in his vehicle and in the fireproof document case in the library, the case he had installed in 2004, and that held the deed, the title insurance policy, the property survey, and every significant document relating to the house's ownership and condition. He called Ed Callum that evening. Ed picked up on the second ring, the way he always did. Walter said, "I want to thank you properly. The voicemail you left was the earliest documentation of her presence. It established the timeline in a way that closed the gap she might otherwise have used. If you hadn't called and left the message with the timestamp, the 9-day duration would have been her word against mine." Ed said, "I almost didn't leave a message. I almost just hung up and figured I'd try again." Walter said, "I'm glad you didn't." Ed said, "Is it over?" Walter said, "It's recorded, which is better than over." Ed laughed, the short, dry laugh of a man who had spent 30 years managing the distinction between situations that were finished and situations that were documented, and who understood that the documented version was more durable. He said, "When are you going back to Portland?" Walter said, "Saturday morning. 2 more weeks and the cardiologist clears me." Ed said, "I'll keep an eye out." Walter said, "I know you will, but this time there's a form." He had asked Diane to draft a neighbor consent form, a single-page document, clean and plain, establishing Ed Callum as Walter's designated property observer during his absences, defining the scope of the observation, authorizing Ed to contact Walter by phone, and, if Walter was unreachable, to contact Diane directly, and including Ed's signed acknowledgement that his role was observation and notification only, not entry. Diane had drafted it in 20 minutes, and had called it the most straightforward document she had produced in 18 years of practice. Walter brought it to Ed's door Friday morning. Ed read it, all of it, which Walter had expected, and signed it at the kitchen table with a pen he took from a cup on the counter. Walter signed the owner's acknowledgement line below it. He gave Ed a copy and kept the original for his document folder. Ed walked him to the door and said, "Same code as before?" Walter said, "New code." He gave it to Ed on a card, a single index card, the code written in Walter's handwriting, Ed's name written above it. He said, "Keep that somewhere, you'll find it if you need it." Ed said, "I will." Walter drove back to the farmhouse and walked through every room one more time. The same walk he took before every departure, confirming the condition of every space, noting anything that required attention on his return. The central hall was as he had left it. The architect's drawings were on the wall. The library notepad was on the desk, the third sheet still absent where Karen had torn it out. He had not replaced the pad because it was his pad, and he saw no reason to replace something that was still functional because a page was missing. The kitchen was clean. The master bedroom was his, arranged the way he had arranged it 22 years ago, and every year since. He locked the front door Saturday morning at 6:15. The key turned in the lock the way it had always turned, the alarm armed on the new code. The house was dark behind him, and the hillside was in the early light above it, and the gravel drive was empty, and his vehicle was at the end of it, pointed toward the county road in Portland. He sat in the car for a moment, the same moment he had sat in the car 22 years ago, when he had pulled over at the gravel drive entrance and looked at the roof line above the tree line, and the for sale sign that had been there long enough to qualify as a fixture. He looked at the house from the drive's end, the way he had looked at it that October morning in 2002, the Victorian facade, the wraparound porch, the limestone foundation, the roof line against the hill. Carver Ellison's architect had told his client he was building something that would still be standing when everyone who knew Ellison's name was dead. He had been right. It was standing. It was Walter's. It had been Walter's for 22 years, and it would continue to be Walter's in the complete and unambiguous and recorded sense that no 9-day absence and no master key, and no probably not coming back, had altered by a single instrument or a single line in the county's property record. He pulled onto the county road and drove north toward Portland. The house sat on the hill behind him in the morning light, the way it had sat there for 137 years. The way it would sit there long after everyone who knew this week's story was gone. The limestone foundation holding, the 60-year roof holding, the plaster and the millwork and the newel post, and the architect's drawings on the wall in their frames. All of it exactly as it had been left, exactly as it had been built, exactly as it was recorded.